Mini lectures are an effective way to communicate with students. They're an important form of instructor-to-student contact. Mini lectures are used in a variety of ways. They're used for introductions, to set the tone for a lesson, to elaborate on a complex topic, as a tutorial or simulation. And over the next few minutes, you'll learn some best practices for creating and recording mini lectures. The objectives for this course are listed below. We're going to learn how to suggest best practices for creating mini lectures. We're going to list ways to design an effective video experience for students. We'll describe a plan for recording a mini lecture. We're going to be able to explain the 1-5-1-3 model, and we'll be able to record a mini lecture using best practices. We're going to go into the research. The research shows that shorter videos are more engaging. Ideally, a shorter video would be about 10 minutes long. And you want to spend time making that video short enough so that you have logical chunks of information for them to listen to. Also, you want to make sure that you intersperse talking heads, which you'll see down in the bottom corner here, with slides. It makes it more engaging for the students. You want to use a personal feel, so you can see me stuttering a little bit, you can see me waving my hands around, and that's a little bit more engaging for students than something very polished and studio quality. It gives you a more personal feel, and it makes you more approachable to the students. Instructors who speak fast and with enthusiasm are more engaging to the students than instructors who are speaking slowly and talking like they're reading from a script. It makes them sound boring, and it certainly isn't fun to listen to. Students also engage differently with lectures versus tutorials. So when you're creating a lecture, you're assuming that the student is going to listen all the way through without stopping. When you're creating a tutorial, you're assuming that the student is probably going to stop and take notes, is going to stop and practice what you're teaching them, is going to stop and rewind and re-listen to what you're doing. So in a tutorial video, you probably want to create your chunks so that there's space in between for them to stop, logical stop points for them. When you're creating your slides, your video design, you want to make sure that you're doing it in such a way that it makes sense for the students. So you want to make sure you're establishing a context for what you're putting on the slide. You want to make sure you're defining the problem. You want to make sure you're labeling. You want to provide background information for what's going on the slide, and you want to explain the key elements of the slide. You also want to explain everything, create meaningful chunks. You want to explain all the steps that you're going through in a problem set, for example, and you want to use visuals. So you'll notice that here I don't have pictures because I don't have any pictures that are logical for what I'm showing you. But if you have visuals like graphs, or you have tables, or you have images that lend themselves well to the subject matter that you're teaching, visuals are a wonderful thing to add to your mini lecture. Make sure that you minimize cognitive load, and by that I mean make sure that you're not overwhelming the students with too much text, too much images, too much movement. Make sure that your writing is easy to read. Make sure that your text, your fonts are big enough for them to read. Make sure you're keeping the key information available to them. Make sure that your layout is easy to follow. And then emphasize the key areas of the problem that you're trying to show them. Again, use an engaging voice, so make sure that you're speaking quickly enough. Make sure that you're excited about your topic, and that the length of the video and the pace of the video is good for learning. Again, we talked about how in a lecture format you're talking about going from beginning to end, and you're expecting the students to listen to it in one listen. And in a tutorial or simulation, you're probably going to be expecting the students to stop, take notes, solve a problem, maybe rewind, so your pace might be a little bit different. Make sure there's no distracting behaviors or sounds. If your cat jumps up on the table, that might happen. It may be cute and you may leave it in there, but your dog barking in the background for 15 minutes might be too distracting for the mini lecture. And students may work along with their own problems while you're doing yours, so make sure that you give pause points if that's the kind of lecture you're giving. So now we're going to get prepared to do your mini lecture. When you're planning a mini lecture, the important thing is to be prepared. Make sure that you're drafting the key concepts that you want to convey. Talking off the cuff is great in class, but when you're doing a mini lecture, you'll find that you start stumbling all over yourself, and it's very difficult to get your thoughts back in order when you're talking in front of a camera. So make sure you draft the key concepts that you're trying to convey. It's helpful to do an outline. I find that doing a script is better, but you can see I'm not talking with a script today. I'm talking just off the cuff. Having an outline to help you stay focused is a very good idea. When you're doing your mini lectures, try to avoid doing time-specific events or circumstances, and by that I mean don't say, hey, Merry Christmas everybody, or hey, how about that hurricane we just had, because a mini lecture is something that you're going to be able to reuse over, and if you're talking about a time-specific event and it's July and you just said Merry Christmas, people are going to be confused. So if you kind of keep it evergreen, then you can reuse that mini lecture multiple times without it being confusing for the students. Use a webcam so that they can see your face, they can see your expressions, they can see a personality behind the voice. Check out the area where you'll be recording. You can see behind me I have pictures of my family and a box of tissues. So nothing too embarrassing, nothing too weird. I don't have a plant sticking up behind me that has feelers so that I look like I have antlers or anything. So just check around you and make sure that there's nothing that might be distracting. And then you might want to create a test recording to make sure that your voice sounds good, that your lighting is good. Make sure that there's nothing behind you that's distracting, and then you're ready to go. If you use a webcam, again, minimize the distractions and external noise. I closed my door so that I didn't have students walking by making sounds. Make sure there's adequate lighting. Lighting's always important. Make sure that you're not sitting in front of an open window or that you have lights behind you, because that will make you look like you're a spy in a spy novel. Pay attention to what's behind you. And I say that because I had a faculty member that I worked with who recorded a mini lecture. The mini lecture was beautiful and perfect, except in her office she had this Elvis clock. And her Elvis clock had, the way that it kept the seconds was the legs would go back and forth. And it was just over her shoulder. So everything was perfect in the mini lecture. She did a great job, but all you could see was Elvis dancing over her shoulder. So she had to re-record the entire thing. Smile and be yourself. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to stutter. It's okay to do a little bit of that because you're a human being and you want your students to see that about you. And stop looking at the camera, at yourself in the camera. You're supposed to look over here. Consider using a headset like I have or an external microphone. The headset that I have is a Logitech headset, and I find that it's the absolute best for recording mini lectures because it's easy to use, it's very comfortable, and it picks up sound very well. There are several options for creating a mini lecture. For this mini lecture, I'm using PowerPoint with Microsoft Office 365. PowerPoint lets you record audio directly onto your slides, and it will also allow you to record video directly on your slides. So you can see on this mini lecture, my video is in the downward corner. There's also Screencast-O-Matic, which allows you to incorporate audio and video into your presentation. It's a free version, and it will record up to 15 minutes of audio and video. You can pay a little extra and get a more sophisticated version, but it costs money, but it will let you do things like editing. There's also Camtasia Studio, which allows you to do screen capture recording, and it includes editing tools, but you must purchase a license. And then we also have WebEx here on campus, which allows you to record audio and video presentations. So now we're going to go into this 1513 model. This is a great model that I found online, and the link to the presentation where I got this information from is in the references section. And this would be one of the distractions that you want to make sure that you don't have in your mini lecture. So there we go. So the 1513 model is very practical, it says, and it's good for planning lecture videos. You'll notice that the numbers here total 10, which is the ideal number of minutes for a mini lecture. And it helps you decide how to break that up. So the first one is the introduction and setting the stage. So obviously when you're doing your mini lecture, you want to establish some context. You want to tell them, why is this important to me? Why do I care? Give them an idea what you're going to cover. Tell them how this ties into the learning objectives, how this ties into the lesson, why they need to learn this information. In the meat of this mini lecture, you're going to be dividing up your content, the chunks of content that we've been talking about. So in this particular model, it says divided up into 5 chunks. So each one is going to be a minute long, and a minute is not very long time, so you need to pick out the most important stuff from each of those topics that you want your students to learn. Some suggestions would be difficult concepts, things that you know your students are going to have trouble comprehending from the lesson. Stories of professional stories, things that you know from your own experience or from professional examples that you might want your students to come away with. Making sure that they understand how things tie together. So these are the kinds of examples of things that you would use in these subtopics. If you have less than 5, then you can spend a little bit more time on each of the topics. You would just use less topics. Make sure that you use good pacing, make sure that you're being engaging, make sure that your layout is good, all of those things that we talked about earlier. Make sure that you have all of that mixed in. In the next minute of your mini lecture, what you're doing is you're tying it all back together. You're saying, I told you what we were going to learn. I told you what we learned. Now I'm going to ask you to think about what we learned and check in with you to make sure that you learned what we learned. So this would be where, if you had the capability, you might have a knowledge check question, or you would ask them to pause and reflect on what they learned. Asking them to think about how that tied in with what they've learned so far, asking them a true or false question, asking them to write a reflection that they might turn into you after they finish watching the mini lecture. Those kinds of things would be appropriate here. And finally, you do the review and close. So this again ties into the big picture. You remind them of the key points so that they walk away with the refresh in their memory. And then you close the video identifying the next things that they need to do. So after they've watched this video, be sure and do your assignment, be sure and turn in your reflection, be sure and read the next 2 articles, and then read your reflection. So here are some examples of things not to do in a mini lecture. And I'm sure you've seen a few of those examples during the mini lecture, but here are some deliberate outtakes. You can see here in this slide that my face is covering up the text. So when you're creating your slide, pay attention to how much information you're putting on the slide and where the text falls, because particularly with PowerPoint in Office 365, you'll see that the talking head stays down in the bottom corner, and it does cover up the bottom corner of text. On this one, you can see, oh my goodness, there is way too much information on this slide. And if you're embedding this in Blackboard, it gets even smaller. And if they don't think to expand the slide to full screen, they're not going to be able to read this at all. And here, there's cognitive load and no context. There's just too much information. The problem hasn't been defined at all. There's no way for students to understand what they're supposed to be doing with this information. So when you're putting a chart or a graph or an image or anything on the screen, be sure and help the students understand why it's there, what's the importance, what do they need to be looking at, what do they need to do, either verbally or visually. And then here is all the bad habits. So you heard me earlier hear the intercom go off. So that's definitely something you don't want to have happen. Scratching your nose like I did just a little while ago, that's a bad thing. Hitting the microphone, not a good idea. Talking to the camera, which is what I'm doing right now, not talking to the camera the whole time is a bad idea. So I've pretty much demonstrated all the things that you're not supposed to do in this mini lecture by doing them in my mini lecture. Shuffling papers, letting your phone ring. Those are things to be sure to pay attention to when you're delivering your mini lecture. And the next thing is the references. So we have some really good references and further reading for you. Elevate Your Teaching Presence is where that model is located. So I would strongly encourage you to go back and look at that because that's where all that research came from. That's where the model came from. She's really brilliant. And these two articles up here are very good, very brief pieces about how to do mini lectures and what the best practices are. So I would strongly encourage you to go back and just browse those first 3 links to get some pointers about mini lectures. Thank you.